Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the Mechanicum. We're going to be looking at all of their faction rules, all the cool new stuff they've got, as well as their HQ units that enable all these things and use them as well. In this video, we are going to cover the Advanced Reaction and the Warlord Traits for the Mechanicum, the Orders of High Techno-Arcana, the Cybertheurgy, how it works and all their powers, and also Archmagos and Magos HQ units. But before we do that, if you enjoy the content, please do leave me a like and a subscribe. And if you've got any comments or feedback at all, please leave them down on YouTube below. And now, on with the show. The Mechanicum's advanced reaction is called Scornful Fire. And this is quite powerful. What it does is all units within 12 of a unit, including an independent character that's being shot, get to shoot at the attacker. So it's like a mass return fire. So your independent character's unit and every other unit within 12 gets to shoot it back. Now, what's interesting about this, and this could be FAQ'd at some point, but this is the way it works right now, is it triggers on declaration of the shooting attack by the enemy, and all of your stuff is going to shoot at the enemy. Now, unlike other advanced reactions, which say, the attacker still gets to shoot even with models that may be removed, etc., this doesn't have that clause. So all of these units get to shoot at the attacker before it shoots you, which means if you kill them, they lose shots. Very, very powerful. You really don't want to target a Mechanicum independent characters unit with anything that's high value, because it's going to be in real trouble. The other interesting thing about this as well is automata type units, which is a lot of the Mechanicum robots and stuff, normally can't react. But in this case, the reacting unit is the independent characters unit, which means that the other units are not reacting units, they just get told to fire. So also as well, this does give you a way to sort of bypass that restriction in some ways. It means you do actually get to do some shooting with those units that can't normally react, which is really good. So a very powerful advanced reaction to start with for the Mechanicum. And then a quick look at the Warlord Traits. So they get access to the 3 basic rulebook Warlord Traits. They also get 3 of their own. So the first is called the Soul of Cold Iron, and it means the Warlord and all units within 6 can move and charge whilst pinned. They can also shoot snapshots, which you can do anyway, and they also get a movement phase reaction. Now, this is pretty decent in a lot of ways. Pinning immunity or anti-pin and stuff, generally very good. It's a shame that it's got a movement phase reaction, particularly because so much of the stuff in Mechanicum has got very low initiative. Like, the things that can react tend to be, initiative 3 or heavy or something like that, so not really as good. But the anti-pinning is good, and it does interact with Cybertheurgy a bit, which we'll talk about soon. Then they've got the Logic of Victory. So this is, if the Warlord doesn't make a shooting attack and isn't in combat during your turn, you get an additional reaction in every phase in your next turn. That's a lot of extra reactions. And also as well, the Warlord and his unit get an extra weapon skill, ballistic skill, and 3 initiative and movement during their reactions, which is really, really big in terms of a buff, but it's got a very big downside in that Mechanicum Warlords tend to have a lot of guns or be quite good in melee and that kind of stuff. You can put a lot of stuff on them. So if you're going to use this, what you really want to do is take a very weak Warlord. You don't want to waste all of his guns and all that kind of stuff, because ultimately what's going to happen is you're going to end up not using it in order to activate this. The other downside to this is that because your stuff generally isn't very good at reacting in a Mechanicum army, it means that if you take this, you get a lot of reactions, but you're not necessarily able to use them unless you've got a army that doesn't, have a lot of robots in, where you're using the more infantry-heavy stuff. So, good for some builds, but not so good for others. Then we've got the Science of Slaughter, the last one. What great names these have got. It's so cool. What this does is, on the second and onward turns of being locked in a combat, your Warlord gains 1 weapon skill and strength. So, turn 1 in a combat does nothing. Turn 2 in a combat, plus 1 WS and strength. Turn 3 in a combat, plus 2 WS and strength. And you're also getting an assault phase reaction as well. Now, this is okay. Like, a lot of combats, particularly between elite units, do tend to go on for a couple of turns. But the downside to this is, in the first, which is generally the most decisive round of combat, it actually just doesn't do anything. Which is, in my book, a little bit of a problem. It's like a delayed action trait. And when you do get the buff, the buff is good, plus 1 weapon skill is good, but it's not so huge that it sort of makes up for not having a buff in the first place. So while this is cool, and I could definitely see me taking this in things where my Warlord's going to be in combat a lot more, I don't think it's particularly powerful. I think overall this set of Warlord traits is pretty decent, but not super special, although certainly very coolly named and very flavourful for Mechanicum. With those two things done, let's talk about the Orders of High Techno-Arcana. So these are the Mechanicum equivalent to Legion traits and Rites of War, basically. Mechanicum don't get any of that, so this is the way they get their sort of army traits. These are a trait that comes on your Archmagos, and your Archmagos in your army, of which you can only take one, is going to pick one of these orders. And what this does is it gives him some benefits, himself, and it also affects the army in some way as well, depending on what you do. You can only take one of these, but you can take multiple in different detachments as well. So, you know, you could have multiple Archmagi with access to different special rules, potentially. And the rules for these are interesting in that they carry on even if the Archmage just dies. So you don't suddenly lose all these benefits like you would lose them with a Warlord trait. The first is Archimandrite. So the Archimandrite are the sort of ruling class, the people who have broken all the deals and all that kind of stuff amongst the Mechanicum. This can include an allied Mechanicum detachment. Now, the Mechanicum army construction rules, the different Divisio Tacticas, as they're called, which we'll talk about in another video. You've got the Questores, you've got the Taghmata, which is the main army list, and also the Warlord Titan list as well. You normally can't ally them together in the same detachment because they guard their secrets very jealously and they don't like working together, according to this book. But what this does is let you do that. So what you would get out of this normally is you'd be taking a Taghmata list, which would then give you the ability to ally in some Questores, which gets you armigers, or possibly ally in a Titan Legion as well, which gets you access to Skitarii and the Skitarii bits too. And this is the only way you can do this, basically, as well. It also gets access to 2 different Cybertheurgic Arcana as well, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Everything in the Cybertheurgic Arcana is basically instead of making a shooting attack. So this doesn't really let you do 2 different things. It just gives you more options. So it's not super incredible. It just gives you a bit more flexibility. All battlesmiths in the detachment gain an extra thing they can do with the battlesmith. And this is common to these orders. A lot of them modify battlesmith in some way. So in this one, when you battlesmith a unit, instead of repairing it or something like that, you can let it use the battlesmith's ballistic skill for the rest of the shooting phase. So in this case, that would be 5 with your Archmagos, or 4 with your lower level Magos, but everything's got BS4 anyway, so that wouldn't really do much. Or you can give something Power of the Machine Spirit, which is quite good because some of the vehicles and units, a lot of them come with some kind of anti-infantry weapon and some heavy weapon, but they can't split fire. So being able to give them Power of the Machine Spirit and let them split fire can actually be quite cool. So a good utility option, really, Archimandrite. You're probably mainly going to take it if you want to include some allies, but what it does is generally just useful, whatever your build is. Next, we've got the old favourite Cybernetica, one of the classic ones from Horus Heresy 1, and, as we all know, an army full of robots is what this enables. The main thing that this does is it gives you your Castellax line. Castellax are troops choices in the Liber Mechanicum book, so giving them line means that you can take that all-robot army and still play objectives. It also has a very unusual ability where automata within 12 inches of 2 units with Cortex controllers reduce enemy cover saves by 2. Now, that's a big cover save reduction, but cover save's not that big a deal or even that common to be at a level where reducing them by 2 matters, and 2 Cortex controllers so close as well. Strange niche rule. Archmagos also gain Patris Cybernetica, so this is the rule that lets Magi join units of robots as well. So Archmagi don't normally have that, but in this case they do. And also he can't be wounded while he's in a unit with robots as well, so even if the enemy snipes you and that kind of stuff, you can still allocate the wounds to the robots. Pretty simple Techno-Arcana this. It's quite impactful, obviously, especially if you want to build an all-robot Cybernetica army, which I do and already have. The buff with the Cortex controllers is kind of weak, but there's no drawbacks or restrictions on this Techno-Arcana either, so quite a simple one if you want to build your robot army. The Lacyraemarta, that's a tough word to pronounce. The Lacyraemarta are the masters of thralls and servants, you know, all that kind of stuff. They are focused around doing things with infantry in the army. Now, although they're the masters of thralls, you know, techno-thralls, servitors, that kind of stuff, in theory, their units work well for any infantry, so that also includes the different Myrmidons as well, rules-wise. So firstly, any unit that they join as Rendon, Poison, and Fleshbane attacks made against it reduced to a 6, which is, you know, an okay thing, particularly the Rendon bit is good. The Archmagos himself uses the Ephemera Lacyraemarta Cybertheurgy power, so that's one of the unique ones that you only get access to if you take this Techno-Arcana, which is pretty good. We'll talk about that later. All battlesmiths in the detachment can target infantry with their battlesmith. They can heal a wound, great on Myrmidons. Obviously doesn't do an awful lot for thralls because they'll be dead, so you can't heal them. Or you can make the unit move, double its initiative, and it specifically calls out that this doesn't count as running, but it obviously does count as movement, which is pretty cool because, you know, you can make a unit of thralls move a few extra inches. You can make a Myrmidon cult move a few extra inches towards the enemy, you know, particularly if you've got Secutors who want to get into combat, they're not that fast. That's a pretty cool and interesting ability. And also as well, there's nothing that stops you targeting a unit with multiple battlesmiths in a turn, technically as well. So in theory, if you lined all your stuff up really well, you could, you know, maybe really jump something forward with this using lots of this ability, which is kind of interesting. I think this is mostly, from a rules perspective, a really good, interesting way of playing a Myrmidon cult-style army that doesn't involve using Myrmidax, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Healing them precious wounds on Myrmidons, getting them extra fast, getting them around the board, and the Cybertheurgy power does similar things and is really interesting too. So I really like this one. This is my favourite new one in the book. Then we've got Macrotek. So Macrotek are the engineers, basically, or the engine seers would probably be more accurate. Now, Tech Priest Auxilia count as troops. Tech Priest Auxilia are a pretty cool unit. In the new book, they are an elite slot, but they are line. They're not super durable, but they, you know, bring some cool engine seer actions. If you do take them, obviously making them troops online is great, using Macrotek. It does restrict them to taking the engine seer Arcana, which is one of their unit options, but it's the one that makes their battlesmith better, and so it's really good anyway. What this also let you does, which is super interesting, is before objectives are placed, and also, as I read it, before you've decided which deployment zone each player is taken, you get to move 3 pieces of terrain up to 6 inches. So before the battle, they've got to end up 2 inches away from any other terrain piece. Now this can be good or weak, or depending on the armies you're playing and depending on the board itself, but you can do loads of interesting things with this. You can make corridors that are too difficult for vehicles to pass by moving buildings close together. You can move cover away from objectives, you know, if you want your opponent to have to stand around in the open on an objective. If there's a big line of sight blocker in the middle of the table and you're playing a shooting Mechanicum army, you might just want to move that along a little bit to get yourself some clearer fire lines. There's all sorts of interesting things you can find to do with this. And again, I love rules like this where they're a little bit more interesting than just another +1 to hit or something like that. The Battlesmith ability in this detachment is that you can repair buildings, which is super interesting, a little bit niche. But you can also reduce all breaching, rending, and exoshock versus a model that you choose to 6+, which is really good if your opponent's relying on those kind of things. You know, some of the Ren 5 autocannons or plasma to be able to hurt your, you know, things that are quite tough like robots. Now, this rule is written a little bit weirdly. It reduces things from hits, not wounds, and hits aren't allocated to a model. So if you do this in a unit with multiple things, the timing doesn't work out and it's not clear, but I think it's very obvious how this is supposed to work, at least anyway. Much easier from a rules perspective if you just use it on single model units, but hopefully this one will get an FAQ to clear up exactly how it works. And we've got Malagra. So Malagra are the Myrmidons, the War Masters of the Mechanicum. So this is a Techno-Arcana that buffs all of the units basically in terms of melee. So every character model that you take can have a prehensile data spike for 10 points, and that gives you a single extra attack with the model, which is Strength 5, AP 4, Breaching 4+, Murderer Strike 6, and Reach 2, which is potentially very interesting. You know, like, for the same reason Paragon Blades are potentially good, there is just an opportunity just to kill enemy characters and things with this. You know, it's not going to happen super often, but it's certainly something your opponent's going to want to be aware of / a little bit scared of when going up against models with these data spikes. The Tech Priest Auxilia that you take in the army can be Interfector, which is a different option for them. That basically gives them prehensile data spike on the Auxilia and lets them scout as well, which is quite interesting. And then there's this new unit called the Architor Magisterium, which are the assassins / sort of keepers of the ways of the Mechanicum. And they normally come with a Vorax or an Arlatax, which is, they sort of jump around the battlefield fighting things. Instead of doing that with a robot, you can just take them in a unit of 3, which I guess there is a lore reason behind. But then they move independently once they start. So you get a bunch of these independent characters in one slot that can move around. I'm not sure there's a super great in-game use for that, but it's certainly cool. The Archmagos himself gains preferred enemy characters and Precision Strikes 5 and Monster Hunter, which is obviously very good against Dreadnoughts, which is quite good. I don't think overall this is the most powerful choice because it doesn't really affect your army so much or, make big changes to your army. But if this is your jam, if these guys are something you find interesting, it's great that there are, some modelling opportunities and a way to represent them on the table. And, maybe this Architor Magisterium unit is something we're going to see in plastic soon because it's kind of come out of nowhere a little bit. Then we've got the Myrmidax, so the Destroyer cults, which I really like. I've got a bunch of these in my loft, which is kind of handy because I love them very much. So these guys can take a Thanatar Calyx, and it all make as an individual unit, which does some special things. And they also make Myrmidon Secutor's troops, not line, and Myrmidon Destructor's elites. All Myrmidons within 6 of that Thanatar Calyx that you take gain line and +1 to combat results. So this doesn't quite give you a line on the Myrmidons, but it gives you a way to give them a line, and, as long as they're near this Thanatar, your opponent can kill it, which will deny you a lot of line, but they are very, very tough. The Archmagos himself gains Hatred Everything, which makes them, good in combat, as opposed to mediocre, which is their default, and they gain 2 wounds, so they go up to 5 wounds base, which is, quite a powerful buff. Now, these are the obvious choice for a Myrmidon cult. It helps ease your slot choices a little bit, and it also gives you the ability to make those Secutors and Destructors line as well. I wouldn't rely on them being line, because you could lose the Thanatar, so you probably want some other line as well, but having the opportunity on it is great. The Thanatar Calyx is unfortunately a little bit pricey, despite being a fantastic model. It is a little bit pricey in points. It's not the most efficient unit in the world, but, for doing this, for what Myrmidax do, it's pretty cool. And lastly, we've got Ordo Reductor, who are the other Ordo you used to be able to play in Horus Heresy 1. So the Ordo Reductor are, good at destroying things. That's their thing, in a nutshell. And their Battlesmith ability that they gain is basically turning your Battlesmith into a harm instead of a heal, if you're familiar with the D&D terms. So what you can do to enemy targets that you would normally Battlesmith, so like vehicles or dreadnoughts, or enemy or buildings, is you can cause an automatic hull point or wound with no saves allowed. So you Battlesmith an enemy dreadnought, loses a wound. Or you can automatically immobilize or weapon destroy it on a vehicle as well. So Battlesmith an enemy Spartan, immobilize it for the game, which is kind of cool. Now obviously you've got to get into base-to-base contact to do that, in theory. But, so it's probably not going to be quite the super cool thing you can pull off it might look like, but it is a really interesting option. You also pick 3 areas of cover or buildings before the game. If their areas of cover, they lose their cover save and become dangerous terrain, which is a really good thing to be able to do to opponents who are going to camp cover, or if it's a building, you roll on the building damage table. The Archmagos also gains the Artificia Reductor Cybertheurgy Arcana, which is a little bit of a shame, because if he could take one of the other ones, which increases the range of your Battlesmith to 12 inches, he could have immobilized vehicles at range, which would have been quite nice. It's an unusual spin on the Battlesmith, so making him a little bit offensive instead of defensive. Not super powerful, but again, very popular Ordo, and cool that you can represent it on the table. So now we understand the orders of High Techno-Arcana, let's talk about Cybertheurgy. So Cybertheurgy is roughly the same rules as Psychic Powers, although the book is very clear that these are not Psychic Powers. Things that affect Psychic Powers don't affect them, but broadly you're making leadership tests at the start of phases, and you're gaining a weapon as well, the same way as Psychers gain weapons. Most of these powers can be used in 2 modes. They can be used without a check, or they can be used with a check, but to do something more powerful, but with the obvious drawbacks of if you fail the check. If you fail the check, you get something called Cybertheurgic feedback. It deals a wound to a Cybertheurgist in the unit. So unlike Perils, you can't push this off to your unit. Your character has got to take it, unless you've got another character in the unit, but that's going to be quite uncommon. And the bigger drawback to this is, if you fail that check, it instantly pins your unit, which is a huge drawback, especially since a lot of the time your Cybertheurgists might be in quite expensive units. Now, if those expensive units are automata, they're fearless, so this isn't going to be a problem. But if you're doing something like joining a unit of Myrmidons, or joining a unit of Tech Priest Auxilia or something like that, you are going to pin yourself, which is pretty bad. Made even worse by the fact that when you pin yourself in your own turn, pinning doesn't wear off until the end of your next turn. So you'll actually be pinned for 2 of your own turns, in effect, which is really not great. Now, all these powers work instead of making a shooting attack. So that means if you use a Cybertheurgy power, you can't use any of the guns on your character, and you also can't use Battlesmith either. Now, I don't know if this is intentional or not, it may well be, but it seems like a real shame, especially since a lot of these units are expensive, that if you use your Cybertheurgy, you can't also use your Battlesmith at the same time. It really sort of makes these characters feel a little bit sort of meh in a lot of ways, because there's so many abilities tied to both of these things, and you only get to use half of them. Maybe that's completely intentional. Maybe they felt like it was too much to do more, but I personally would hope that gets FAQ'd to let you use both in some way. For the weapons, which we're going to go through, there's a special rule called Data Gin, and that means that they can only wound vehicles, automata, and dreadnoughts. Now, some of the weapons have other effects that don't need to wound, so it's not always that big a drawback, but basically these weapons are for destroying machines. 3 of these Arcana are standard options, and some of the others are locked to the high Techno-Arcana that we've just talked about. So let's talk about the Cybertheurgy Arcana themselves. The first is Artificia Machina. So this lets you use your Battlesmith at range 12 inches, which is great. One of the biggest drawbacks to Battlesmith is needing to be in combat with things. And when you do that, you can choose to make a Cybertheurgy check. And if you pass the Cybertheurgy check, you get to use the effect twice. Now, as it's written, you have to use the same effect twice. So normally you're going to be restoring a wound to a robot, probably with this. And for a Cybertheurgy check, you restore 2. That's pretty good and powerful, really. You know, these units are quite tough, and being able to give them 2 wounds back a turn is quite a big deal. The weapon that you get with this as well is pretty good. It's range 12 inches, assault D6, and it's got haywire and data gin. So this is basically D6 haywire shots. Normally this is going to be on a ballistic skill 4 or 5 model, and obviously that in itself is just very powerful. You know, being able to shoot a bunch of wounds off a dreadnought or shoot a bunch of wounds off a vehicle is just really good. So very good default Cybertheurgy Arcana this. The second Cybertheurgic Arcana is Artificia Cybernetica. So this targets an automata within 12 inch, an automata unit within 12 inches, and you give them one of 3 benefits. Either they can use reactions until your next turn, which is a big deal, a really big deal, because they can't normally, or they can roll 3d6 and choose the best 2 when they charge, or they can ignore the first wound when they get shot until your next turn, which is also pretty cool. You just wait till you get wounded, you just ignore it. It's pretty great. So you can optionally test. If you take the test and pass, you choose 2 of these, and if you fail, you obviously choose 0 of them. So a lot of the time you will just be choosing the reaction one and not making the roll, you know, not risking the roll. But using the reaction one on the ignore first wound one as well is also quite powerful. This is just generally very good. And if you are playing Cybernetica and you have got units of robots on the field, you definitely want to be using this because reactions are just so good in this game, and turning that on is quite a big deal. The weapon is also good, so it's range 12, strength 10, AP 1, assault 1, data gin, and instant death. So it's not quite as good as the Machina one. You obviously are only going to be able to affect vehicles and dreadnoughts with this. It's pretty much good for shooting dreadnoughts, though. It's not particularly great at penning vehicles, but against a dreadnought, they're going to get their invulnerable save, and if they fail it, they're going to take D3 damage from that instant death. So that's pretty decent. The third common choice for Cybertheurgic Arcanas is Ephemera Incursus. So this is the one around taking control of enemy stuff. So you target an enemy automata or vehicle, not a dreadnought, within 12 inches, and you can shoot with that vehicle with snapshots, which is really good. Now, you do that without a test, but if you do choose to take a test, you can fire at your own full ballistic skill instead. If you pass, if you fail, you don't get any shots at all. Now, what's really cool about this is, after you use it on an enemy unit, the enemy unit gains hatred of Cybertheurgists for the rest of the battle. Now, on vehicles, generally, that's not going to do much, unless you did it on an enemy knight. And, you know, you're not going to be fighting against automata very much. But I just think it's very cool that the unit gets really upset that you took control of them and now hates Cybertheurgists for the rest of the battle. Really good flavour. Very good if the enemy's got a good target for this. But if the enemy hasn't got a good target for this, it can easily be, you know, quite wasted. You know, it's hard to get within 12 inches of something worth doing this to. But that's okay, because you do this instead of shooting, and you can always just do other things instead. The weapon on this, though, I really like. Very, very cool. 24-inch range, strength 3, assault 6, Datagen, blind, and Vox silence. So Vox silence is -2 leadership, and it turns off, as written, Nuncio Voxes. It calls out another specific Vox, which I've forgotten, and then it says, and all similar war gear. Wow, that is a interesting piece of rules writing. So I think the way we are probably going to be playing this, I presume you guys would agree, is anything that says Vox on it probably gets turned off by this. So they all stop working until the enemy's next turn. Now, this has got Datagen, so it can only hurt vehicles and dreadnoughts, etc. But the blind and the Vox silence don't require you to do any damage. They only require you to hit. So this ability makes someone take a blind test and gives them -2 leadership. And if you then follow that up with other things like pinning or concussive, of which there is a lot in this army, this can be really good. And it's got a 24-inch range as well. It's ignored by stubborn units, but not fearless units, which is kind of weird. Just seems like a, you know, accidental misstep there. But this is a very, very good weapon. I really like it. Anything that does this kind of stuff, like at-ranged leadership and debuffs like blind, is really good. And this is what I'm going to be using in my armies where I'm not running robots for sure. Then we've got the two more unique Cybertheurgic Arcana. So these are locked to the high Techno-Arcana where you take them. So the first is Ephemera Lacyraemarta. So this one mimics the abilities of the Lacyraemarta Arcana, mostly. You choose a friendly unit within 12, and it can move double its initiative, this time directly towards the nearest enemy. So really good for getting Myrmidons into combat. Really good for running a bunch of thralls up the battlefield, although you might have to not have quite control over the direction. If you choose to take a Cybertheurgy check, the unit also gains Furious Charge 1 and Hammer of Wrath 1. Now, I really like this because it pushes Myrmidon Secutors from Strength 7 with their special axes up to Strength 8, which is obviously a very important number because it means you instant death enemy Space Marines. So effectively, they're armed with Thunderhammers under this power, which is really good for Myrmidons. If you fail the check, the Cybertheurgist and the target unit suffer the feedback, though, which means you're going to pin yourself and you're going to pin your unit of Myrmidons, which is probably not something you want to be doing unless you're, I mean, luckily you're a leadership 10 Archmagos, but probably not something you want to do unless you think the payoff is worth the risk. The weapon that they get is a melee weapon, so it's Fleshbane, AP3, Radphage, and Concussive 3, which is a really interesting option for your Archmagos. I don't think it's something you're going to use all the time, but you might want to take a go at Radphaging an enemy Dreadnought or something like that to make it easier to kill on successive turns, or even just an enemy character who's then going to go down to toughness 3 and be instant deathable by, you know, any further hits. Concussive 3 is obviously also very good. I really like the concussive rule, but it takes effect at the end of the phase, so you need to be in combat for 2 turns for it to matter. But if your opponent does fail that leadership test, losing 3 points off their stats is quite a big deal. I really do like this Cybertheurgy, and I really like the high Techno-Arcana as well, and I definitely want to play it and make use of it. And then we've got Artificia Reductor. So Reductor also get their own Cybertheurgic power as well. Now this one is super interesting and a really unusual attack vector. You target a transport or a building within 12 inches, and you have to make a check. If it's successful, any enemies that are embarked in that transport or building have immediately got to disembark. Now, can you imagine how many strategies in this game are revolved around people putting stuff in vehicles and driving it at you, and how many things you can mess up by forcing the enemy unit to disembark and then just shooting your army at the Death Star that was safely protected in the Spartan-shaped box. That's really cool and really interesting. You can't use it on flyers, notably, so if you do use Storm Eagles, you're safe from this. They also get a melee weapon, which is Strength 10 AP 1, Armor Bane, Exoshock 3+, Unwieldy, Cumbersome, and Datagen. Now, the only possible use for that combination of stats is to hit vehicles, and if you really, really want to smash up a vehicle in combat, you can definitely have a good go of doing it with that weapon. So that's all the Cybertheurgic powers and all the higher orders of Techno-Arcana we've seen, what they all do, loads and loads of choice, lots of stuff to do. Now let's look at the units that bring these things to the battlefield. So firstly, we've got the Archmagos Prime. He's got the Orders of High Techno-Arcana special rule, so he picks one of those. He's also got Cybertheurgy, Fire and Protocols 3, so he can fire 3 guns, Battlesmith 4, and Relentless and Stubborn. He's got a lot of rules. Quite expensive stats-wise compared to a Praetor. These guys are Weapon Skill 4, Ballistic Skill 5, Strength and Toughness 5, 3 wounds. They are Leadership 10. So, you know, they're strong and tough. The biggest thing that lets them down in terms of combat ability, they're very good at shooting. They've only got 2 attacks. Weapon Skill 4 and 2 attacks base does not make a good combat character. And in fact, he's worse in combat than a Space Marine Centurion and some Space Marine Sergeants even. What they do get is a page full of options, and it is so much fun to build these guys and think of the way you're going to make them look to convert them to use all this different stuff. They can have notable options, and there are a lot more than this, but they can take Chain Fist, Paragon Blade, Archaeotech Pistol. They've also got a Photon Gauntlet as well, which causes blind checks and has AP2, and all these things are cheap. They're all a lot cheaper than the points you would pay for them on Space Marines by about 5 points generally. So the pistols are costing 5, Plasma Pistol costs 5, etc. So you can take 2 in that category. The next category you've got is a one-of, where you can take a Graviton Imploder, which is a 2-shot, no template, AP3 Graviton weapon. So great for haywire or killing a couple of Space Marines, or a Servo Arm, or a Machinator Array, which does turn the Magos much better in combat. So an extra 2 hits at Strength 6 that are also Shred, Armor Bane at Initiative 1. So that makes them good in combat. You can also take a Conversion Beamer in this slot as well, which is generally not a great option, but people love Conversion Beamers. And then the last category you've got is guns. So you can take one of these, an extra gun, above maybe the Graviton Imploder and the pistols as well. So good options in this category. You've got the Graviton gun, you've got the Photon Thruster, which causes blind and has AP2 at range. You've got a 3-shot Plasma weapon, the Phase Plasma Fusil. Alternatively, you can take a Rad Furnace instead, which means that anything in the combat that you're locked in, your stuff needs 1 less to wound enemy things as well, which is kind of good. 30 points, so quite expensive. If you're a Myrmidax Archmagos, you can take 2 of these guns as well, but you can't take the Rad Furnace, so it's kind of like any other Myrmidon, really, 2 guns on his back. And then there's also some utility options that you get to take as well, which are all great and really cheap. So you can take an Augury Scanner for 5 points, which you're probably going to do because Augury Scanners are great. You can take Rad Grenades for 10 points, which are really powerful. Very hard to get access to Rad Grenades normally, especially hard to get them on units that can really make use of them. But if you take one on this Archmagos and he joins a good combat unit, they can be a game changer. Notably, he makes himself instant death enemies. He gets to Strength 6 with a Paragon Blade or with his Machinator Array, and with his Rad Grenades it means he instant deaths everything, even though his strength is a bit on the lower side. And you can also take a Cyber Familiar for 15 points, which means that along with his 4+ invulnerable save he's got built in, puts him down to a 3+, and makes him quite tough. Toughness 5, 3+ invulnerable save is really good defensive profile. So just a couple of ideas of how much you pay for these guys. If you give them 2 Grav Guns, so the Graviton Imploder and the Graviton Gun, and give him an Archaeotech Pistol or maybe a Photon Gauntlet, that's a 205 point unit. So he's got good shooting, he's going to buff your units, he's got a power weapon in combat, which is not amazing, but like a lot of Mechanicum stuff, does mean it isn't nothing, and he's 205 points. quite on the expensive side, but does do quite a lot for you. Alternatively, you've got the sort of combat version, where you take a Rad Furnace, Rad Grenades, a Machinated Array, and also a Mastercrafted Paragon Blade, and you can also add some pistols on top of this if you want to as well. That's 240 points, and it's going to give you, you know, the weapons off the Machinated Array to fire. It's going to mean that in combat, the enemy's -1 toughness, you get 1 extra to wound them, and you've got that Paragon Blade to just chop some people up as well. So there's all sorts of different ways you can build these, and you will find it's really fun to do so. And as an example, I'm going to show you mine. So my Archmagos Prime, that I'd actually started building and converting before Horus Heresy 2, although I'm going to have to change his weapons a little bit now, is Archmagos Prime Decimus Xalk. And look at the size of this list of stuff that these guys have. It's so much fun. So mine is a Myrmidax Archmagos, so that means he's got 5 wounds from the high Techno-Arcana and hatred of everything. So we're going to turn him into a melee Archmagos. He's got Ephemera Incursus, which I'm going to use to try to blind people and reduce their leadership by 2. I'm going to give him the Stoic Defender Warlord trait, which means that his unit pins and also gives me a shooting phase reaction. He's got a Cyber Familiar, so he's got a 3+ invulnerable save, so when he does end up in duels, hopefully that can keep him alive against actual instant death weapons. He's got Rad Grenades, and he's going to be joining a unit of Myrmidons, which means the whole unit of Myrmidons is going to be instant death stuff left, right, and centre with their axes. He's got an Augury Scanner, because it's 5 points. He's got a Photon Gauntlet, which is good for killing a couple of Marines, putting a couple of wounds on Terminators because it's AP2, but it forces blind checks is the main thing. And then for his melee options, he's got a Paragon Blade, so he is going to be going first with enough strength to instant death things, and maybe Murderous Strike if he gets it. He's got the Machinated Array, which also gives him a Melter Gun, and then he's got a Graviton Gun on top as well. So when he's shooting his Photon Gauntlet, Melter Gun, and Graviton Gun at an enemy elite unit probably. That's going to cause a concussive check, it's going to cause a blind check, and he's also got Ephemera Incursus as well, and he can switch that out for one of them if he wants to, probably the Photon Gauntlet. The Ephemera Incursus is going to cause the blind, and give the opponent -2 leadership when they take that concussion check, and if he does any wounds, his Warlord Trait's going to mean that they also take a pinning check as well. The idea with this guy is, he's going to make people take so many checks, they're hopefully going to fail one of them. That's going to mean that their weapon skill is going to drop from concussive or blind, and when he goes into combat, even though he's only weapon skill 4, they're going to be less. He's going to have extra attacks, reroll on his hits from his hatred, he's going to have the Machinated Array attacks, he's going to have his Paragon Blade, and hopefully he's good in combat, but in a different way than a Space Marine. So rather than just having great raw stats, he's got lots of abilities that mean that he ends up winning the combat, and that to me feels very Mechanicum. 245 points is super expensive to do all this, but he does a lot. He's tough, he's hard to remove, and he has also got the ability to take control of enemy vehicles as well. So ultimately, I love building these Archmagos Primes. I think it's really, really cool, and I really can't wait to make the model, and I'll definitely be posting up some pictures when it's done. So the other Archmagos Prime option, and you can't take both in the same detachment because they've got a rule called Feudal Hierarchy that stops you taking one of each, is the Archmagos Prime on the Abeyant. Basically the same as the Archmagos Prime. You pay an extra 30 points, but he gains Toughness 6 and also 2 extra wounds as well, which is pretty good. They get a rule called Pride of Place, which means they can't be transported, which is similar to Horus Heresy 1, and they gain the Monstrous and Anti-Grav special rules as well. He also can't be Malagra or Myrmidax Techno-Arcanas, so they're a little bit more limited in what they can take. But generally, for 30 points, that's a pretty good uplift. Toughness 6 and 5 wounds makes him really tough. And if he's got a Cyber Familiar as well, it means that he's going to be quite tough, which he needs to be because he's monstrous, so he won't be able to join units a lot. Now, monstrous does give him some advantages. It means that he can fire all of his weapons, and firing Protocols 3 on these is great, but you can actually get more than 3 guns on them, especially if you include the Cybertheurgy attack as well. And also, on top of that, he's immune to pinning, which means when he fails those Cybertheurgic checks, he doesn't pin himself too. So really interesting option, these. Pretty cool to be having a character that can actually just hold his own, walking around the battlefield. I suspect you would find if you spent 300 points on this, your opponent would still be quite happy to shoot him with a lot of las cannons, but definitely a cool option, particularly for those really awesome conversion opportunities for models on Abeyant. Then we get to the Magos Dominus, so the slightly smaller Magi, the more servant Magi. So these guys get the Patris Cybernetica rule, which means that they can join units of robots natively, which is great. They're also heavy as well, which is, nice thing. They get Cybertheurgy, and they've got Leadership 9, so they're pretty good at using those Cybertheurgy powers. Really, they're better at using the Cybertheurgy powers in a lot of ways than the Archmagos are, because they're cheaper and aren't going to pin important units as much. So they also get Fire and Protocols 2, like a mini Archmagos, and they get Battlesmith 5. They're relentless and stubborn still. They also get Feel No Pain 5, which is interesting, but the stat line on these is more like a Space Marine Sergeant. They're Toughness 4. They do get the 4+ Invulnerable save from the Mechanicum Protectiva, though. So, reasonably hard to kill. When they take the Cybertheurgy, they are particularly good for Artificia Cybernetica, in my opinion. I think these guys are 80 points if you bring an augury scanner with them. And if what your objective is to make all your robots able to use reactions, then bringing these guys with your robot units to do that is a really good way of enabling that. As I mentioned, augury scanner as well. That's augury scanner is not a buff to be sniffed at when sticking one of these in a unit. I like these. They're bringing Battlesmith, they're bringing Cybertheurgy for relatively cheap. They can join units so that they're protected as well. Ultimately, if you don't bring Cybertheurgy in these Mechanicum armies, you're missing out on quite a lot of stuff, and the Archmagos can only be in one place at a time, and is probably more of a combat-inclined unit than anything else. So the Magos Dominus does get almost all of the options that the Archmagos gets. They miss out on some of the big ones, like the Graviton Imploder, but they do get almost all the options, but they're a little bit weaker, and I wouldn't go too crazy on making them super expensive. Certainly, just using them for their buffs is a really good way to use them. They also have an Abeyant option as well, so again, largely the same as the Magos Dominus without the Abeyant. 30 points gets you Toughness 5 and 4 wounds, which does then make them quite tough. But they also get Monstrous, they also get Pride of Place as well. So they're good for the same reasons the Magos Dominus are good, but it's quite a lot of extra points and quite a big survivability disadvantage in Monstrous that you probably don't want to look at these unless you're doing it for a conversion opportunity or because you play purely narratively and you really want to put one of these on the table, which is great. I think from a gameplay point of view, these are probably just a bad idea. Like, they're expensive and it just lets your opponent shoot your important support piece, so you're probably better sticking to normal Magos Dominus from a gaming point of view. Alright, well that was a pretty long episode, quite a lot to cover in there, so let's summarise it all. In this section alone, just looking at the army's special rules, there is so much choice, and there's no obvious auto-take options either. There's loads of different ways to build the force, loads of different ways according to your playstyle, tons of modelling opportunities, tons of variation, and you've been given loads of rules that let you match the visuals of what you want to do with your army, and that's something I always really like. You should always have rules that let you do the things that your army looks like it's supposed to do, and this book does that. There's nothing here that's obviously overpowered. In fact, I would say when you compare the Cybertheurgy stuff to psychic powers, or when you look at the points you pay for an Archmagos to get these things, given he can't use Battlesmith and these things at the same time, etc., I would say these are very much on the tame side, actually. But I think that's fine. In a game about Space Marines, one of the non-Space Marine factions being a little bit on the weaker side than Space Marines is better than them being better than the Space Marines, probably. I mean, all being super balanced would be ideal, but that's never going to happen. But either way, this is very, very exciting, and lots in here that I'm really excited to play with. I do like the Cybertheurgy risk versus reward mechanics, and the really interesting, data gin style weapons they've got. I actually think they're very well written. Less good than what Space Marines have got, but I think they're really cool and very well written. I do think it's a shame that you can't use them at the same time as Battlesmith, though, and again, I'm going to say hopefully that's an oversight, maybe a bit of a pipe dream. I think the auto pin and drawback on Cybertheurgy is maybe a little bit much. I think that's probably, although there's ways around it by putting them in a unit with automata, which maybe is what they want you to do, I still think it's a little bit too big of a drawback. The Orders of High Techno-Arcana give you so many options, and they are flavourful and effective, and there's more than we've ever seen before from Mechanicum, certainly in Heresy 1. It gives you lots of ways to build the same armies as well. You know, there's lots of ways you can build a robot army that aren't just Cybernetica. There's lots of ways you can build a destroyer cult that aren't just Myrmidax, and there's lots of ways you can just mix all these things up as well. And I think whatever your flavour, your favourite stuff from the books or the lore, or whether you just want to build something that's effective on the table, you've got so many options here, absolutely. Magi customization in particular is just so good for your army lore, your army flavour. Those characters just embody the Mechanicum so much, and they really are a converter's dream. And I'm not the biggest hobbyist in the world, but I love converting these guys up. You know, if you just buy a few 40k kits for extra bits, you know, you have some extra bits of Forge World stuff laying around. These guys can do so much on the battlefield. The Archmagos particularly. They can be shooty, melee, they can be both, they can be a support unit. They are expensive, but, you know, I wouldn't have it any other way. Just being able to build these guys is so much fun. And that's the end of the show. I hope there's been some useful information there. I hope that you guys have really enjoyed it. If you have, please leave me a like and a subscribe. And any comments or feedback you've got, please drop them down below. I'm sure there may be a few bits in there where there's been some misreads or some oversights. It's a new book, so forgive me for that. See you all soon, guys. Bye-bye.